Welcome to our introductory course on Eternalism, the divine philosophy of the eternal worlds. Unit 17, Three-Tier Thinking, Part 3. In Unit 17, we introduce the foundational, transitional, and contextual elements of three-tier thinking by adding a third tier. This structure resolves a second contextual primacy issue, distinguishing foundational from derivative contexts, and avoids the "it depends" error. This pivotal clarification addresses a critical error, affecting all 5 core questions of philosophy, laying the groundwork for greater clarity and consistency. The key to understanding three-tier thinking is seeing it as an advanced form of mind mapping, going beyond 2 tiers. Think of it in 3 parts: foundational, tiers 1 and 2, transitional, tier 2, and contextual, tiers 2 and 3. Let me break it down for you. This illustration does a great job showing the foundational nature of 2-tier thinking, tiers 1 and 2, but it misses tier 2's transitional role and the contextual nature of tiers 2 and 3. To capture all 3 parts, we need to switch to an illustration of the full 3-tier model. Let's start by noting the 3-tier structure, which goes beyond the usual 2 tiers. You'll see that the letter X appears twice, once in tier 1 and again in tier 3, but in different contexts. Here's the key takeaway. Tiers 1 and 2 are foundational and decisive. This is where the real battle for gospel primacy happens. Tier 2, however, is both transitional and pivotal, which is why it's highlighted in a different color. Tiers 2 and 3 are contextual and derivative, representing a shift from the foundational context and meaning in tiers 1 and 2 to a new secondary meaning and context in tier 3. We'll dive into the details shortly, but for now, notice how the colored asterisk on the second X signals this important shift in context and meaning. To understand this 3-tier structure, let's focus on tiers 2 and 3 and the crucial relationship between content and context. In 3-tier thinking, keeping track of content and context is crucial, but thanks to its visual 3-tier structure, it's easy to follow and illustrate. In addition, we'll use familiar items like bare feet, socks, shoes, and socks with shoes to represent the content and explain the pivotal transition in context between tiers 2 and 3. All in all, this should make understanding 3-tier thinking a fun and easy task to master. Let's start with something familiar. Which comes first when putting on socks and shoes? The answer is, of course, socks. But here's a twist. Which comes first when taking them off? This time, the answer is shoes. Why the shift? It's all about context. Different contexts lead to different answers about primacy. This brings us back to the tension of 2-tier thinking. When asked which has primacy, socks or shoes, the answer often feels uncertain. It depends, and it does, on context. If you're putting them on, socks come first. If you're taking them off, shoes do. This simple shift in context often left students feeling flustered and unsure as to how to answer what appears to be the simplest of questions. But underlying this simplicity is the most critical of errors, a philosophical misstep that one could easily classify as a philosophical derailment. Consider this cartoon illustration. 2-track foremen stand toe-to-toe over the misalignment of 2 sets of railroad tracks. One shouts at the other demanding, "Whose fault is this?" The other simply yells back, "It depends," as though this were answer enough and somehow settled the issue. Now think of the philosophical derailment that occurs when every major core question of philosophy, what is real, true, good, just, and beautiful, is followed by the evasive complexity of "it depends." Let's return to the previous slide and ask, where in this 2-tier illustration did this misstep or philosophical derailment occur? The error occurred in giving tier 1 status to both socks and shoes and lies in failing to recognize that we aren't just dealing with the practical order of putting on or taking off our socks and shoes, but also with contextual primacy, distinguishing between foundational and derivative contexts. This oversight is part of the misstep itself. So let's take a closer look and explore an example to clarify the significance of contextual primacy issues. Consider the content and context of these three scenarios. In the first, a young boy is barefoot outside, wearing no socks or shoes. In the second, he's inside wearing only socks. In the third, he slips his bare feet into his shoes like sandals and runs outside to look for his lost dog. In all three scenarios, there's no primacy issue because only one item, either socks or shoes, is involved. In the first, he's barefoot. In the second, he's only wearing socks. And in the third, he's only using shoes like sandals. This is key because in 2 or 3 tier thinking, primacy issues arise only when there are 2 terms, items, or elements involved, and at least 2 tiers representing a hierarchy. Now let's consider 2 new scenarios and the issue of contextual primacy. In scenario 4, the boy is putting on his socks and shoes, raising the primacy question, which goes on first, socks or shoes? The answer is socks. In scenario 5, the context shifts to taking off his shoes and socks, raising another primacy question. Which comes off first, shoes or socks? The answer here is shoes. Now we've reached the critical point, where contextual primacy comes into play. We must ask, which context has primacy, putting on or taking off socks and shoes? Failing to consider this question leads to the philosophical derailment we discussed earlier. Let me explain. If we treat the context of putting on and taking off one's socks and shoes as equivalent, we commit the fallacy of contextual equivalence. This error misaligns the philosophical tracks, creating confusion and inconsistency by giving Tier 1 status to both socks and shoes and failing to distinguish between the foundational context of putting on and the derivative context of taking off one's socks and shoes. This philosophical misstep can be avoided by considering contextual primacy, which involves 2 key issues: primacy of content within a given context and primacy of context between the related contexts. By now, we're all familiar with the primacy of content, the socks and shoes issue. But what's less familiar, and just as important, is the primacy of context. Which context takes priority, putting on or taking off socks and shoes? The key is identifying the foundational context so we can properly relate it to the derivative one. In this case, it's clear that putting on socks and shoes holds foundational primacy because you can't take them off until you first put them on. So putting them on is foundational, while taking them off is derivative. Consider the 3-tier structure for socks and shoes. In context 1, tiers 1 and 2, the foundational act of putting on socks before shoes is shown by assigning tier 1 to socks and tier 2 to shoes. In context 2, tiers 2 and 3, the derivative act of taking off shoes before socks is shown by assigning tier 2 to shoes and tier 3 to socks, marked with an asterisk to indicate the context shift. The shoes are highlighted in orange to emphasize their transitional role, pivoting between foundational and derivative contexts. Now, if we return to the original mind mapping using the variables x and y, you'll see that we've applied the same 3-tier structure here with socks and shoes. In this case, the foundational primacy of tiers 1 and 2 is assigned to putting on socks and shoes, with shoes at tier 2, highlighted in orange to show their transitional role. The derivative context of tiers 2 and 3 is assigned to taking off shoes and socks, completing the 3-tier framework. The point is simple. In the foundational and derivative context of putting on and taking off footwear, socks always hold tier 1 status, and shoes always hold tier 2 status. This consistency avoids the error of assigning tier 1 status to both socks and shoes the fallacy of contextual equivalence, which treats foundational and derivative contexts as though they're the same, even though they're not. The fallacy of contextual equivalence is the root error behind situational ethics. It's why foundational principles and extenuating circumstances are often treated as if they're equal in moral weight, even though they're not. Understanding this now will save us time and confusion later. As we wrap this up, consider Unit 17 as your homework. Once you can smile and say, "Okay, I get it," you're ready to move on. Here's a fun way to test yourself on everything covered within this unit. Create 2- and 3-tier structures using the alphabetical order of A and B, along with their Scrabble values, to prioritize them based on context. Remember to apply contextual primacy, the primacy of content within a context, and the primacy of context between related contexts. Check your results in the Unit 17 overview quiz. This ends this Unit 17 presentation. Thank you for watching. Join us for Unit 18 as we explore deeper insights into 2- and 3-tier thinking and their roles in fully understanding the gospel and the philosophy of eternalism. Don't forget to take the Unit 17 overview quiz to reinforce your grasp of this tension-ridden suspense, often associated with 2-tier thinking.